First of all, thanks for having me. I've been a PARCC associate for probably a decade or so.
Yeah.
And most of the time when I work with PARCC, it's either for a long time it was with the LDF program, working with Middle East civic leaders around debate and argumentation. And then sometimes it's another research project that's totally unrelated to this about public memory and memorialization. But this is my other research project that's been sort of absorbing my time. And I thought, if I can sell it here to the least likely audience in the world, I can sell it anyway. So at the end of this, I'm going to try to hook it back to PARCC and Maxwell, successfully or unsuccessfully. So thanks, Catherine. Thanks, everybody, for having me. My department is Communication and Rhetorical Studies. And so rhetoric, for us, harkens back to the Greco-Roman tradition of public persuasion. So arguably, rhetoric was the first art of citizenship. It was the art whereby average people were taught the power of persuasion, public argument, to go up and debate, to seek judgment. Scholars in my area have expanded beyond that we still study public addresses. So with the presidential campaign going on right now, I have a lot of people losing hair, trying to figure out how all this makes any sense for public culture. Others, like myself, tend to look in rhetoric in often sort of non-traditional places. Whether it's a memorial or, for me, in films, they're all part of the symbolic construction of culture. I came to film not because I was interested in film, but because I was interested in public controversy, which is why I teach argument. And I started getting interested in what I would call sort of non-interest-based controversy. So if people are fighting over where we're going to put a hospital, that sort of rational actor, you say, okay, well, they're interest-based on who gets the hospital, who doesn't get the hospital. But so in the memory stuff, so fighting over what a plaque will say, I mean, I can see it's important, but you kind of, at a pure rational actor approach, you'd say, who cares, right? It's going to build a memorial. Well, there's no money in it. There's no, so that would drive the economists here crazy. Like, why are you spending political capital over a fight that has no actual policy, direct sort of influence? One of the areas I got interested in was film, because I was in a grad class, and this is what happened. You have to write a paper for something. And I happened to read the New York Times, and there was a big controversy over the film The Silence of the Lambs. There were people protesting and boycotting, and I thought, and my first initial response, classic rational actor, was, who cares? It's a movie. You don't like it? Don't go see it. What do you really care? But it intrigued me, and so I ended up spending a fair amount of time looking into the history of people protesting, fighting back against films, and that became a book called Controversial Cinema that looked at the history of American protests over films. And as I was doing that project, I realized, gosh, there's actually one genre that sort of presents itself as being controversial. It says, hey, horror is the one genre that says, come pay us your money because you don't want to see this. Right? A horror movie's really good. You spend most of it doing this, and you think, well, you spent $10. You're missing it. Why are you doing that? Right? And I thought, well, that's kind of odd. And they've also tended to have, they seem to have some relationship with broader cultural tension points. And so that became a second book that looked at the history of American horror film from 1931 to 2000, which is when I wrote the book, trying to map, if you will, movements in the horror film onto broader points of cultural anxiety and turmoil. In the midst of that project, I realized that there were actually two really productive periods of the production of American horror films. The first is what most people call the Golden Age, or really the Universal Monsters period, so 1931 to 1948, which is when all of your traditional monsters, Dracula, Frankenstein, the Wolfman, Jekyll and Hyde, Creature from Black Lagoon, Invisible Man, Mummy, et cetera, all sprang forth. And then the second, which is what interested me, was a period that I call the Second Golden Age, which is 1968 to 1982, where pretty much everything you now think of as horror came out. Amityville Horror, Halloween, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Jason, Friday the 13th. And that became a third book, focused on that period, Dark Directions, Romero, Craven, Carpenter, who I think are the architects of that period, where Night of the Living Dead and all those sorts of films came out. So I was interested in that. And of course, 1968 was, as you know, not a particularly good year. Tet Offensive, assassinations of King and Bobby Kennedy. So this was a really dark period, and so that was part of the interest there. So horror has remained, though, remarkably popular, really since the beginning of the horror genre up until today. So, in fact, I should have included, hey, Shane.
Hi, Hurry.
Good to see you. Just the last couple of weeks, the number one film in the country cost all of $5 million to make. It's now grossed about $60 million. The film called Don't Breathe, My example is a little bit older because I was doing this talk before. Annabelle, some of you may have heard, a movie about a possessed doll, cost all of about $8 million to produce, grossed over $100 million domestic, about $160 million worldwide. The first of this current slate of films, a film called Paranormal Activity, cost $150,000 to make, grossed $250 million globally. So as much as Marvel and Disney dominate the big budget spectacles, if you want to make money, it's in horror. Now I say that not just from an economic standpoint, but because of the remarkable cultural resonance a film that cost all of $150,000 to make can suddenly become an enormously popular. So in order, people are still going to see horror films. For whatever reason, they retain some level of cultural meaning. And it's not just that they're all make a lot of money. There have been a lot of critically acclaimed films. Just two I really think are excellent films. One is an Australian horror film called The Babadook. They didn't make that much money, but it's an incredibly smart film. A lot of critics put it in their top 10 of the year, across the board, not just horror, across the board. Another is an Iranian filmmaker who made a great film, A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, Annie Lily Amarpour. So again, horror doesn't just have to be blood and guts and scary. It actually can be critically acclaimed and provocative. So the current project came from a different problem. So every time I do something, I realize I made a mistake and I have to go fix that mistake. And so this time actually came from an annoying student who asked the simple question, you say horror started in 1931, but what about other films? So that created a 300-page book. So it's absolutely true, though. The term horror begins in 1931. Pretty much can give you day and date. The two films that created the current language of horror, that created the horror genre as a named entity, were Dracula and Frankenstein. Dracula released on Valentine's Day, 1931. And in fact, if you'll notice, when it was first released, they did not call it a horror movie. Whoops. Uh-oh. That's all right. It's all going to come back here now. We'll do that. Plug it back in. There we go. Sorry about that. If you notice, and I'll try not to knock it out again, the poster, it's actually, the tagline is "The story of the strangest passion the world has ever known." In fact, a lot of people at Universal had the idea, like their promo team said, let's call it horror, blood, terror, and people said, oh, no one knows what that means. Let's call it a strange romance. It's a really strange romance. Shortly after Dracula came out, it was so incredibly unpredictably popular. No one thought Dracula would make money. It did. Universal immediately greenlit into production Frankenstein, another Gothic novel. And just a few months in between those, so you can see by the time Frankenstein comes out in November, it's called The Original Horror Show. The language, again, the whole language of horror had been there. I'm not like saying no one had ever used the term before, but really if you track it back, the place where it comes out is in April of 1931. Variety newspaper, the trade publication, says Universal has cornered the market on horror. Universal has the horror cycle all to itself, which is actually a story about how no one else wanted to make these gruesome movies. Universal could do it, and Paramount others said, we're not making those, they're disgusting. Pretty much from this point on, horror becomes the language. The genre becomes defined. So from a purely discursive sense, if you will, we could say that the horror film began in 1931. But there's a problem. Like I said, these things all have to start with a problem. And that is that all of the elements we would say constitute a horror film, monsters and ghosts and hauntings and witches and curses and magic and victims and all that sort of stuff, have been filling cinemas at least since 1896. So there at the upper corner there with the one colorized is a slide still from Georges Méliès's film The Haunted Castle, which pretty much has everything a Gothic horror film would have. Devils and ghosts and things appearing and disappearing and ghosts, etc., etc. The Infernal Cakewalk there next to it, that's not a very good picture, but it's a great film called The Haunted Hotel from 1901. That's Georges Méliès, the first mummy film from about 1902. So in other words, all the things that made up a horror film were there as part of the cultural aspect, cultural language of cinema before there was the term horror. And so when the student asked me, how can you say horror started in 1931, I said, because that's when the language started. That was too easy. That was too easy an answer, and so I forced myself to go back and spend a couple of years in archives trying to figure out what they were. So the real center of the big question is what were these films that were not horror films but had all of the elements to horror films, or more to the point, what was the cultural work those films were doing? We know what horror does. We have an idea of it. What were films doing? What was their meaning to audiences prior to the genre telling us what to expect? What were they doing? Surprisingly, I think there's a bigger story here, and that is that I think these films played a role in the construction of American national identity, as Aaron suggested. I think early films in general played a crucial role in crafting American national identity, but in their own way, not more important, but in their own way, the films dealing with what I'll call horrific elements also played a pretty crucial role in constructing what it meant to be an American, particularly, and this becomes the trick, shifting to creating an American point of view. And that point of view becomes really crucial. How is it that Americans are meant to see the world? Now, in some ways, it's just a lucky historical accident that the first projected image, the first publicly projected film, was in December 1895, and by 1896, these are starting to flood across America. So the birth of cinema, the kind of emergence of it into American popular consciousness, is happening at a pretty important time for American national identity. While America was founded in the 18th century, its identity was forged at the end of the 19th century. And very much the forge of American national identity was during and after the Civil War. Where the country had to ask first legally, then militarily, then governmentally, and then culturally, what does it mean to be America? Not a collection of regions, not a collection of immigrant groups, but a national identity. And that really happens in the 19th century. The 19th century is a fascinating period, and we tend to think, like the history we write of the 19th century is overwhelmingly one of progress. Right? I mean, that's the manifest destiny narrative. Political progress, increasing rights for disenfranchised groups of people, the Industrial Revolution, scientific progress, urbanization, industrialization, rationalization, the creation of bureaucratic federal government, all those narratives of what American progress, that's the story the 19th century wanted to tell. But it's not the only story. And one of the interesting backstories to the 19th century that it becomes important here is the overwhelming, lingering commitment to superstitions, religious beliefs, and old world beliefs, let's call them that. Probably the most dramatic example of that was American spiritualism. Most American history books don't talk about spiritualism. Those that do have it as a kind of offshoot thing related to Houdini. By 1900, there were 10 million Americans who professed to be adherents to spiritualism. Washington, D.C. alone had more than 1,000 licensed mediums. Those are people who profess to reach out to the dead, right? Now, you should know, as people who are living at least briefly in upstate New York, that this all started here, right? Just down the road in a town called Hydesville, which is just outside Rochester. There were sisters, there they are, the Fox sisters, who professed that there was an entity in their house that would answer their question, say yes with one, two with no. Oh my God, did you hear it? Oh my God, did you hear that? That would answer their questions. And sure enough, soon the sheriff came and the preacher came and no one could explain it. Other people came. Eventually they put the show on the road. And it sold out, and people were quite fascinated. Now, the reality is, I think, this is 1848, that would have probably disappeared as any number of hoaxes, the Cardiff Giant, etc. I mean, all this would have just disappeared had it not been for the Civil War. So we should recall, Civil War is a staggeringly bloody war, enormous losses of life. And without the military records that we now have, thousands, tens of thousands of families with no knowledge of whether their loved one had died or not died. You should read sometime the stories of Gettysburg when they were trying to know what to do with the piles of bodies. Some of which had insignias, but some of which didn't. Some of which were just parts. There was no system that we have now. So hundreds of thousands of American families are either unknown, don't know what happened to their loved one, or do know and are traumatized. And so that gives enormous amount of energy here in the latter part of the 19th century for people wanting something more than religion. Remember, this time Americans were not particularly religious. Not that many Americans professed to be any particular Baptist or whatever. They sort of were Christian generally, but not overwhelmingly. So spiritualism stepped in to become that. And it has enormous amount of energy, dies off a little bit, resurges after the First World War, and then eventually kind of becomes what it is today. But this is an enormous part of the country, and not just spiritualism, but superstitions in general. Yes?
So if these spiritual people, I mean this you call them mediums, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Did these mediums refer to religion when they were helping people?
No, and that's a whole other talk, but I'll just mention briefly. The spiritualism kind of tried to become its own religion and could never centralize and organize, probably because it was a hoax. I'm sorry if you believe in that, I apologize, but it is a hoax. I mean, you're not going to get me to believe. But they tried. But unlike the Mormon Church or Christian Science, both of which were out of this region, they didn't build the hierarchy and structure. And so it ended up falling apart. They actually, and this is a good segue, thank you, I like good segues. Spiritualists actually tried to become scientific. And so they really tried to focus on new technology. So it was the science of spiritualism. It wasn't just religious belief. It was meant to be, so kind of trying to wed superstition into 19th century progressive politics. And probably the most dramatic example of where spiritualism tries to intersect with science and technology was spirit photography. So this on the right here left for you is William Mumler's famous photograph. Anybody know who the woman in black is? Okay, let me ask this question. Anybody get a sense? I know it's kind of hard to see the spirit behind her. Who does that look like?
Lincoln.
So that is actually Mary Todd Lincoln, Lincoln's widow. And the story that is professed by Mumler, total garbage, is that Mary Todd Lincoln, unbeknownst to him, came in for a sitting, and he didn't know who she was. Of course, no one knew her. And he just took this photograph, and lo and behold, there was the spirit of her husband standing over her. There are literally thousands and thousands of spirit photographs, and you know, levels of quality. I actually think the one on the right, the one on the other side there is better done than the Mumler photo. Surprisingly, disturbing number that portray children. Because again, child mortality was pretty high at that point. So you can imagine the number of, I'll call them hucksters, out there saying, oh no, we can capture this. Your daughter is still with you. There she is. You can see her, right? So perhaps it's not surprising that when film comes into America, and again, early films, there's no talk, there's no sound, the narratives are often very short, not fully developed narrative. To make a narrative film in the early part of the emergence of cinema, one really had to use already known stories. And of course, one of the things people already knew was about ghosts. I mean, because this was in the atmosphere. And so not surprisingly, there are an enormous number of films that come out that deal with ghosts. My favorite, this is an Edison film called Uncle Josh in the Spooky Hotel, which, as its title suggests, is about a guy named Uncle Josh who goes to a hotel that, you know, no surprise, is spooky. You can get this in the library. This is on the Library of Congress website. You can watch this film. This figure keeps popping in and out, and it's the ghost, right? The guy, the thing in white there is the ghost. And there are lots of little things. So it's midnight, and people knew what this was. There's not a thing that says this is a ghost, or there's no titles. There's no one saying, oh my God, it's a ghost. You just see this thing appear and disappear. But people knew in the 19th century, because of spiritualism, of accounts, of books, of magazines that were circulating, they knew what a ghost looked like, they knew that it came out at midnight, they knew all these sorts of things. So early filmmakers really embraced this idea, particularly foreign filmmakers. In fact, it's worth knowing that up until about 1910 or 1912, the vast majority of films Americans saw were not made by Americans. The appetite for films was so much greater than the American capacity, and it was the French who had done it first and better and were quicker. So most of the films Americans saw were not American. Most of them, in fairness, were French. That led to an interesting confluence. One was that there was, as I say, a glut of films that were focused on the supernatural, or what became so-called the weird. And so there's a Selig, which is actually an American production of a haunted baby carriage, because aren't they all really haunted? That was a wild and weird experience of the Bewitched Baby Cab. Cave of Spooks is a fun trip down into hell to meet Satan, which was a weird picture. And then this bottom one really captures what starts to happen. Increasingly, supernatural films become associated with foreignness. A lot of that is European. But it's also, there's a very Orientalist strain. And so this touch of mystery is a Hindu magician who leaves a curse. And again, it creates a feeling of the weird and uncanny. So the real movement during this period to create a sense that the weird, the supernatural, the unnatural are foreign. Now, as American filmmaking industry starts to, because eventually, you know, it does pretty well. You might have heard, Americans make films. We do okay. Eventually, American filmmakers, really, they get together. There are a lot of things they do, including an illegal monopoly, but we'll set that aside. They really want to craft an American style of filmmaking. And the French have already done a great job with the marvelous and fantastic and Méliès's trick films. So the Americans have to make their mark, and their mark is through realism. So there is Another Man's Wife. No particular reason I picked that other than what makes an American film good. It's a realistic drama, pathetic and gripping. Mother's Thanksgiving, which is an Edison film, the strength of the piece is the plausibility of it all. And so throughout the sort of latter part of the 1900s, really the teens, there's this push not only by filmmakers, but by the critics, the motion picture magazines that are now spreading everywhere of saying what makes a good film is it's realistic. That's how Americans make films, yeah.
They listed it by the length of the reel, not the time?
Absolutely. Because these were physically cranked.
Okay.
So depending on if Joe had a date and the projection's booth, that might be a really quick film. If Joe just got dumped, then it's going to be a long film because he's sobbing in between. So you'll find they're overwhelmingly listed by the length of the reel.
When does that change?
Once you get to synchronized automatic projection, which doesn't happen until close to the 20s.
Okay.
Yeah. Prior to that, the projectionist was a physical person with a crank. And there's a whole, we can happily talk about that. It's fascinating the way films were shown. So one of the things, this gets me sort of the point of today's talk, one of the things that really starts to develop as American films. So this is one of the reasons Westerns become American. Not just because you can film them out in the West, which is the other reason that California becomes the center of filmmaking, but because Westerns were realistic, right? They were drawn from history. These were real people with real guns, and so that becomes the hallmark of American filmmaking, and all those films about ghosts and witches and magic and curses, that's all them. So you start to see this separation, American and other. The other thing that really starts to happen, and this is an interesting example, American film is meant not only to be realistic, but it's meant for the betterment of American citizens. Films are designed to make people better. That's the story, right? That's Hollywood's story, the American story. And one of the things, so this is a column from 1912 where this pundit would recommend what Hollywood should do. And he says, Hollywood's job is to go after social ills, of which superstition has probably done more harm in the world than war, famine, and pestilence. And uninquiring credulity has been one of the greatest curses that ever afflicted mankind and set the clock of civilization back 1,000 years. And so American films really started to not only say we're realistic and they're other, but American films started to really target superstition as a source of comedy and folly. And so there are dozens and dozens of films that I call superstitious folly, which are comedies based on the idea that someone thinks they see a ghost when they really don't, or they think they're unlucky when they're not. They think Friday the 13th is bad when it's not. They walk under a ladder, and it's all designed to show that Americans aren't superstitious and that to be superstitious is to be the object of ridicule. Now, that's not to say that things like horrific elements like ghosts disappear entirely. Rather, it creates this really unique American framework for the horrific or the supernatural, in which, overwhelmingly, right, from 1910 until 1931, overwhelmingly in almost every American film, almost every American film, the thing that looks like a ghost or a monster or whatever is explained away. This is a framework I call the American uncanny, in which what you think is a ghost is actually just your own folly. We all know, really, it's not. For me, the most popular example of this, and maybe the generation gap is opening, this won't work, is Scooby-Doo.
I was going to say.
Right. And not the later scrappy Scooby crap. I mean the original Scooby-Doo, where the thing in the mask is always Mr. Drucker, the pharmacist who was going to steal whatever, right? I mean, this becomes the overwhelm. So pretty much overwhelmingly between 1910 and 1931, virtually every American-made film that deals with something horrific explains away the horrific thing as being a hoax or a mistake or someone's foolishness. So let me just briefly talk about two films I think exemplify the way this becomes part of American identity. So now we've got the separation from American and other. Other are superstitious, other believe in these things, Americans don't. But you take a next step. What does it mean to be a real American? One of the best examples of this, I think, is an early D.W. Griffith film. You may know D.W. Griffith as the director of Birth of a Nation. I can happily talk about the politics of that film. I'm not using Griffith to support those politics, but I will say as a filmmaker, he was pretty much on the pulse of things. In 1910, he made a short called Rose, a Salem Town that I think really captures the move in which incredulity, which is skepticism, becomes wedded to the notion of American exceptionalism. The film is pretty straightforward. It involves a young woman who we never know is anything other than the Sea Child, because that gives her identity. She is living in Salem. Around the time of the witch trials, she meets a trapper. You see our trapper there. We learn that the daughter lives in poverty with her mother, and the mother ekes out a living telling fortunes and nursing the sick. Unfortunately for the Sea Child, she has not simply caught the eye of our rugged American trapper, she's also captured the eye of a Puritan deacon, and the deacon seeks to threaten her and extort her into taking his hand in marriage. When she refuses, the Puritan deacon accuses the mother of witchcraft, and they then bring the daughter and mother in to be burned alive at a stake, which did happen. Enter our trapper, who decides that that shouldn't happen. He goes and gets his friend, the Mohawks, and it's interesting in this film that the Native Americans are actually portrayed as being positive and good. He gets his friend, the Mohawks. They come and rescue the daughter, although the mother evidently is burned alive. It's never mentioned in the film. It seems disturbing, but she just kind of, oh well, we got the young one. So it's your classic melodrama. You could put this as a guy trying to steal the farm and strapping someone to the railroad tracks. Absolutely classic, except that it decides to use the Salem witch trial as its framework. And indeed, early in the film, the opening slide is this that describes to us: reliable authorities state that 9 million human lives were sacrificed through the zeal of fanatic reformers during the Christian epoch. Religious fanaticism was in most cases the cause. Still, there were many victimized to satisfy a personal grudge. So Rose of Salem Town uses superstition within the broader framework of the damsel in distress, and it's the film's climax that ends up being the trapper protecting her from the Puritans. It's interesting in this variation that, and this is very much the story of the discovery of America, except it's not the Europeans who are the good guys, it's the Europeans who are the bad guys. And in fact, the Puritans are portrayed, not the Native Americans, but the Puritans are portrayed as this kind of exoticized other. They wear this kind of ridiculous Puritan kind of exaggerated clothing with the big buckles and the big hats, and they're the ones who are dangerous and violent. Stark contrast, and here this will start to maybe sound familiar, is the trapper. And the trapper is a good example of what we call in literature the American Adam. And this is usually a white person, European descent, who ends up in the woods somehow, has to overcome danger, and becomes self-reliant and rugged, and then becomes an American. That's how you become a real American. The trapper is distinctly different than the Puritans. He navigates the world. He lives in the wilderness. He's not afraid of the native peoples, but is in fact their friends. And indeed, it's the trapper who must rescue the Sea Child, and I think symbolically America. But interestingly here, he doesn't rescue America from the native tribes. He rescues it from old world European beliefs. He then becomes this kind of idealized version of American masculinity, and crucial, he's American masculinity because he doesn't fall into old world traditions or beliefs or stereotypes, and he's also not afraid. He's not afraid of the accusation of witchcraft. He's not afraid of the native tribes. He is bravely willing to move back and forth between them. This then becomes essentially the story of American exceptionalism. What makes America better than the native tribes who were here first, what makes America better than the Europeans we came from, is this rising up from those old world beliefs and superstitions, achieving a new, rational, pragmatic approach. Real quick, just one more example that I think is a little bit more advanced, and I just love this film. It's called The Ghost Breaker. The Ghost Breaker is a 1914 film from Cecil B. DeMille. It focuses on an American protagonist named Warren Jarvis, who is a kind of hard-fighting Kentucky rough guy with guns. In the plot, he's drawn into some really complicated plot involving a Spanish princess, hidden treasure, and a supposedly haunted castle. Wherein I always think of Indiana Jones when I think of Jarvis in this movie. There's a great scene in Indiana Jones where the guy comes out with the sword and he's spinning, and Indiana just shoots him, and there's American exceptionalism in its. Jarvis is kind of the precursor to that, in that he ends up in these haunted castles, but he's completely not afraid. He's completely unafraid. And critics at the time really commented on how it captured this Americanism. So W. Stephen Bush, who reviewed films for the New York Times, wrote, "We love to see a young American brush aside the ceremonies and conventions of the old world and go directly to the action-filled point." And that I think that still very much fits in. In the end, Jarvis is successful. He's able to overcome the superstitions of the group. He finds out that it was some count who was faking a ghost to scare people away in the ridiculous fashion. And in the end, he not only gets the treasure, but he gets the girl. Forgive me, that's what they say. Like other protagonists in films of the American Uncanny or this period in Rose and this one are just two examples of literally hundreds, Jarvis embodies this unique American incredulity. He sees through the marvels of the old world, beliefs and customs. Like his fellow protagonist, Jarvis reaps both romantic and financial reward. And this is my favorite line in the whole movie, as he says in one of the titles, "Ghosts? Are you kidding me? I'm an American." That is the essence of this. As I suggested, just in conclusion, this is not unique. Ghosts, I'm an American, bang, just shoot it, right? I mean, that's Welcome to America in all of its essence. There you have. As early as 1910 and 1912. I mean, these are very early films that are just crafting this idea of what it means to be American, and they're not alone. And literally, I could have spent the entire time going through lists of films that followed more or less this, all up until 1931. So, as a quick thought, if incredulity, skepticism, rationality, pragmatism are wedded with American exceptionalism, it might not be surprising that 1931 is the year in which that cracked. 1931 is the worst year of the Great Depression, the highest number of bank closings, the highest level of unemployment, and we still have a federal government in Hoover who is saying, we can't do anything about it. What do you want from us? Literally every institution of American society that had been built on the promise of progress and economic progress and political progress, etc., were starting to unravel. And so perhaps not surprisingly, people suddenly thought maybe all that promise of rationality and progress and industry is not so stable. And the fracture of the American myth opened up the space for the return of old world beliefs of the unnatural and supernatural in Frankenstein and Dracula. Now, all this may be interesting in terms of film history, but why the hell are you in the Maxwell School talking about this stuff? What occurred to me, I'm not so sure that this tension is not still circulating in American political discourse. I can recall during the last election cycle when our president said, it's not surprising then that they, conservatives, get bitter. They cling to guns or religion or antipathy to people who aren't like them, which then led to the meme of gods and guns, which was quickly adopted by the right, who say, yeah, I am clinging to my gods and guns. Do we not now see a massive motivation around public policy motivated by the distinction between science and anti-science, right? So scientific method, here are the facts, what conclusions can we draw from them? The creationist religious, which is my family from Texas, here's the conclusion, what facts can we find to support it? Is this not still the same distinction between an American identity defined by rational skepticism and incredulity versus a non-American or lesser American that's driven by belief, spiritualism, religion, and credulity? And I don't think, and I'll end with this, I don't think it's just the way Americans portray Americans. I did find it interesting when our public discourse around Islamic terrorism overwhelmingly, I would say, fetishizes the claim of the 72 virgins. Is that not a way of trying to other the political motivations of terrorist organizations by turning them into old world, ridiculous beliefs of some afterlife with 72 virgins as a way of discounting a political conversation about what the real motivations are? All this is to say, this idea of America as a rational country did not emerge out of whole cloth. It was crafted systematically, not just by people like John Dewey or William James or other pragmatists and rationalists, but throughout the broader popular culture that carried the story of American skeptical, rational brashness out into the broader culture to forge what we, I think, still think of as our American national identity. Yeah.
So, the films that you present really kind of come from a white cultural experience, and I'm wondering, are there films from other cultural identities, and do they map onto this narrative of skepticism and American exceptionalism? And so I don't know a lot about film, but when we look at music, we see cultural identity associated with music, and we see different types of music coming out of different cultural identities and maybe becoming mainstream, but if you look at blues or rap, early rap and hip hop, is there something else that was occurring at the same time?
It's interesting. It's an interesting point. There were prior to sound, prior to the introduction of sound, right around 1927 is when it started, and really 2930 is when it dominates. There were an enormous number of filmmakers, and it was actually very diverse, including a very large African-American filmmaking population, a fairly big Latino-based population. There was a large Jewish, mainly in Pittsburgh, filmmaking. So there were lots of different kinds of films circulating. The one I know the best, I guess I'd say, and have seen the most, have been African-American films. And it's interesting the degree to which most, I won't say most, but many of the African-American films, at least I've looked at, so because a lot of them are lost, so you just don't know, map themselves onto the mainstream, if you will, white cinema, but often are trying to recast the racial politics. Oscar Michaud is the sort of more famous of the folks. He actually makes a series of films that are kind of responses to, so Birth of a Nation, I think it's Within Our Gates is his response, right? The Birth of a Race is a response film from, I don't think Michaud, but one of the other filmmakers. So they tended not to deal with superstition or engage in those beliefs, partly because, and this is part of another chapter of the book, the mainstream white filmmakers overwhelmingly portrayed African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans as superstitious. So there's a whole trope. It's very distasteful. There's a whole trope within mainstream, if you will, white filmmaking in which some African American protagonist sees a goat and is scared white. And so they would do a visual effect of a white face where they would scare him white, usually hair up, right? This became a kind of dominant trope. So perhaps not surprisingly, at least most of the films, again, a lot of them are lost, so there's no way of knowing many of them. Those films tended not to go down that road because that road had already been overly determined. But it's interesting that when, in 31, when kind of Gothic returns or superstition returns, they're become very popular. In fact, there's a report from Universal Studios being surprised that Dracula was playing so well in mainly African-American neighborhoods. They just didn't, because they didn't think Dracula would play anywhere. But they're really surprised it was overperforming in these areas, which I think maybe gets at some of that cultural belief that didn't come into their cinemas, but probably did circulate culturally, so that when these films started coming out, they were adapted. And the other thing that's interesting is, like Dracula, there was a Spanish version of Dracula. It was actually filmed at the same time as Todd Browning's Dracula. It was filmed in the same sets, but at night, with a Mexican director and a largely Mexican-American cast. And it did very well. Because I think you're right. I think those beliefs were kind of held subaltern, right, below them. Yes, sir.
In your opening remark, you mentioned that the anxieties Americans have are represented in the films that's made in America. So the events such as, let's say, Hurricane Katrina or invasion of Iraq or Vietnam War or 9/11, have all these events been reflected on or represented in horror movies?
I would say it's so I would say two things. I think it's broader, and I would say the term I use instead of representation, I use the term resonance. I think of resonance as that sort of sympathetic hum. I mean, there are clearly films that are allegorical. So there's just a movie called Purge, Election Year. That was pretty much the election. It was this blonde-haired young woman and this crazy old guy who's rich, who's running for president, and the crazy old guy who's running for president wants to keep this thing where they murder people, basically, for free. So, I mean, that's allegory. I mean, let's be honest, that's not resonance. But I think, for the most part, at least in the broader history of horror, it tends to be broader currents, right? So I'll take the easiest example. In the 1950s, horror kind of dies by 1948. Like, people aren't going to see Dracula and Frankenstein, kind of old hat. And maybe it's going to die. But then it reemerges in the early 50s through the science fiction, the creature feature, the alien invasion. Well, no surprise, right? What's the dominant American concern in the 1950s? It's invasion. And not just invasion, but invasion by Soviets who are portrayed as alien, godless, unthinking, rational, which is funny because Americans are rational. They're irrational. They don't believe in God. They have no love. They're emotionless monster entities coming. Well, of course, we do that. And I would just say, for me, the current spate of films are all haunted house films. And they're usually driven by money, which is funny. If you really watch Paranormal Activity, or I just watched a movie called Don't Breathe that was a really popular box office, won the box office 2 weeks in a row. It's all about money. It's about young people trying to get or keep money. Well, welcome to neoliberalism, right? There you go. Sorry, Lou.
Yeah. What about the confluence of science fiction and horror? I mean, going back to the 1950s, you post atomic bomb, you got all these creatures. You've got Godzilla, Japan, and nowadays a lot of contemporary suspense films or a lot of science fiction films have a significant component of at least suspense, if not horror, maybe even beyond Alien and Prometheus and the Scott films. But also like The Martian, so from a suspense aspect. Do you think that what kind of cultural trend do you see being represented there?
Yeah, so I think you're right. I think horror and science fiction are siblings. I mean, without a doubt, they're both born, at least in film, they're both born at the same time in the 1890s. Out of the love of the marvelous, right? So whether you're showing Frankenstein's monster or a ghost, or you're showing Journey to Mars or Journey to the Moon, you're picking out that marvelous. So they're both out of the idea, and the marvelous not just a spectacle, but the marvelous as an impossible spectacle. That becomes sort of cinema's calling card, and so they're there. Then if you get to the 50s, there are science fiction films popping up, but the origin of the kind of proper genre is in 1951, and there are two films that come out almost back to back. The first is Howard Hawks' film, directed by Christian Nyby, but really directed by Howard Hawks, called The Thing from Another World, in which the alien comes and it wants to eat us and drink our blood and take us over. The one that just comes out maybe 5 months later, forgive me, if I'm not remembering the exact date, is a movie called The Day the Earth Stood Still, in which the alien comes we think it wants to kill us, but we actually find out, oh, it's our friend, oh, damn, wish I hadn't shot him, he's such a nice guy. So simultaneously, you've got these two faces of science fiction. One is the horror phase, one is the progress phase. In 1982, you get the same thing. You get John Carpenter's The Thing, which is a remake of the 51 film that's all kinds of blood, splat, gore, monster, evil, depression, which everybody thought, the studio thought that film was going to be massive. It was going to be a blockbuster. They were marketing the fire out of it. They just thought this is going to be huge. And there's this other film they thought, well, we'll just dump that out this summer because no one's going to want to see it. It's a movie about a little alien, the long finger, who eats Reese's Pieces. E.T. And of course, E.T. So there's a reason I say the second golden age of horror lasts 68 to 82. It died when E.T. was released. And E.T. is Reagan. E.T. is Reagan ideology. Steven Spielberg is the greatest Reagan fantasist in the world. That's not a condemnation. But Reagan was, Dad comes home, law is restored, we go back to the way things used to be. E.T. Sorry, look.
Well, it sounds to me like what you're saying is not so much American identity, but American identities. It's to do. The identity is very dualistic the way you're portraying it. It seems to me that they're both there and they jostle each other.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. And I think what happens in the early part of the 20th century, that's really the late part of the 19th century, the early part of the 20th century, is an attempt to create a singular American point of view that is going to be, really, to be honest, areligious, rational, pragmatic, scientific, and incredulous, always skeptical. Right? So I lived in Missouri for a long time. And I survived. But I lived in Missouri for a long time. And the motto of Missouri is show me. That's why Truman was a great president, because he's, rough and rugged Midwesterner who doesn't believe you on your word, you got to prove it. Right? That's that American identity. And of course, why does that emerge in that time period? Because I think partly because there's a great deal of anxiety about immigration. And so when you read the critics, and again, the discussion of superstition is remarkably pervasive and public. I literally read hundreds of newspaper articles and dozens of books, and could have read hundreds of books that were about Americans falling for superstition. And they're all critical. And I think the reason that got so animated was not just because people were really being tricked by superstition. They were, but who cares? They still are. I think it was immigration. It was all of these others, whether they're Asian others or Latino others coming up, or really the biggest concern was Eastern European others coming, and they were Catholic. That's right. And they cross them. What is that? What is that weird? And they got that water they do, and they wear that thing. It's like, what is that? Come on, we're Protestants. We're Lutheran. We do church a little, and then we go have a beer. And whatever. That was so frightening. And the evil eye and all these sorts of things. And so there's an idea of saying we need to create something that's not that. Which became they need to leave that aside to become us. And the focus was, again, it seems weird in America now that seems right back to being contorted by religious beliefs, if I can say that, that period of the 19th century and early 20th century was one in which religion was really not welcome. And I think it's that fear of the immigrant other, the racialized other.
No further questions? Okay, I think you probably join me in thanking Professor Kendall.